in. Welcome back from your track or your stream sessions, which I think have been fantastic examples of high fire exemplars illustrating the promise and the excitement around digital technologies and around precision medicine. And this session, just for 45 minutes really, is to bring some of those ideas and some of that excitement back into this plenary session, and to ask for expert discussants to join our panel, as they have done, as shown here. In the interest of time, I'm going to let them, they're shown with their names and their titles on the screen behind them. But what I'm going to do first of all is just ask each of them, by way of introduction, I give a general introduction. What we've tried to do is bring together 4 individuals who represent, if you like, the different domains. So representing, first of all, academic medical research within a large university department, we have Hugh Watkins. The perspective from industry, we have Chris Chamberlain from UCB. From the NHS setting, you've heard from Peter Knight, but Peter, welcome back. And Gary Ford, Chief Executive of the AHSN, dealing with the challenge of how to roll out some of these innovations across a broader area. So what I want to do first of all is just ask each of them, and this is going to be very time limited, 30 seconds to 2 minutes. Just give us your perspective from the domain that I've kind of labelled you in. So just try and give us your thoughts of what you bring away from the tracks that you were part of this afternoon. What is it about that particular domain that you think is either an opportunity or a challenge? I introduced Hugh first, so I'm going to go back to him and maybe ask you. Hugh, can you give us your thought? You're a head of a very large university department, the Radcliffe Department of Medicine. It has a lot of basic science in different areas. All of them are relevant to medicine. Big part to play in the Biomedical Research Centre. Give us your thoughts, first of all, about what you take away from the sessions this afternoon.
Sure. So I've been in the precision medicine sessions, and I think there are a couple of very obvious opportunities and a couple of needs that I see from a clinical academic viewpoint. The opportunities are that I think precision medicine lends itself to the strengths of academic medicine very naturally in 2 domains. One is it's one of the easiest places where our ability in basic science, discovery science, molecular and cell biology is one of the easiest, shortest journeys to take that through to clinical impact in terms of diagnostics, understanding better taxonomy of disease. There were some lovely examples today. The flip side of that is that a lot of the people doing this work are clinical academics, and that does much more than just give them access to patients. It gives them access to primary human cells and tissues, and increasingly we need to work in those, not rodent models. And more than that, if you work with patients, 2 other things come. One is that you have the opportunity to generate ideas. You can see what it is about the heterogeneity in your patients that might allow you to stratify them better. And the other is a lot of us have responsibility for clinical care pathways. So we are under pressure to do this better, to find better ways of directing patients to the right diagnosis and the right treatment. And that's something that really plays to an academic medical center. The 2 needs I thought about, I think, are also quite obvious. I have a sense that if you're doing discovery science, it often falls to you to take that out into the world and to gain the impact. It doesn't always work very well just to publish and assume that people will pick it up. So academics increasingly, to get the benefit to patients, to get the impact, need to do that translation. And that brings the second need, which is clearly there are many requirements there where academics don't have the right skill set. There are many other people in the meeting today who will be necessary and effective in that journey. And we heard that there are some quite particular challenges in precision medicine to do with the regulatory environment, the way remuneration might work, and they won't happen without that sort of partnership.
Great. Thank you very much, Hugh, for those comments. Gary, can I ask for your comments now? We heard earlier on about the role of the Academic Health Science Network in helping to roll out innovations. You've heard a lot of wowy examples this afternoon, but give us your thoughts on some of the challenges of a more systematic approach to roll out across a broader geographic region.
Yeah, so if we look at the challenges to the system in general. We're trying to get better value in it's going to be very flat line, small increases in health budgets for all developed countries. So I think both digital technologies and diagnostics, which are a key aspect in precision medicine, and there have been some very nice examples given in the meeting today, are key in moving care closer to the patient out of the traditional hospital model. And that itself will provide a lot of efficiencies. I think the other opportunities are really to give patients a much greater role through access to information in their management, in decision support processes, and that move for patients to have more involvement in their care is going to increase. That's not going to decrease. And you can certainly see that some of the sort of developments like the ALL system, which developed for neurosurgical referrals, can do a huge amount to be more of a patient outward facing thing. We have a lot of problems which again were outlined today in terms of the system processes and the way patients go through the system. Anybody who's ever been a patient or a carer in the NHS will realise there's no other business or service you interact with, possibly with the exception of the police, where you are wasting so much time. And that's also true for healthcare professionals. There's a huge opportunity to use some of the digital technologies and system solutions to improve that. So one of the key areas as a region is the barriers between the different legal systems and the need to get better integration of those, both with information flow and the way healthcare professionals interact across those systems. And again, we do have the tools to do that, but we haven't really started to capitalise on those. So if we look at the challenges, well, I think, again, most of these have been touched on today. The first thing is there's no protected funding for the cost of transitioning and pushing innovation into the system. I mean, the amount of funding the AHSNs and other similar infrastructure has is really small compared, for example, to the healthcare delivery and the research budgets. And you have to protect innovation and transition funding because it doesn't deliver in the single financial year. So so nobody will give you that money in the short term from the provider or commissioning sector. And I think the other thing is, which is I haven't got time to discuss, is that the NHS has a deep resistance to change, and often the healthcare professionals are the biggest resistance to change. And we also, and part of that is that nothing's allowed to fail in the NHS. So failure doesn't exist in the NHS. I mean, people don't stand up and talk about things that haven't worked, except when they're a complete disaster. And of course, to be successful, I think you have to go through this iterative loop of things not working. And we constantly have a problem. The NHS doesn't learn from its failures. And organisations don't look to other organisations as to learn from their experience. And we see that locally. Even the local trusts are not really sharing their experience, and the same goes with primary care and commissioning. So that may sound a bit of a harsh judgment. We do need both a cultural change as well as the sort of technological change.
Okay, great, thank you. Before I come to our other two panellists, please be ready with your questions and comments, either new questions or indeed if you want to pick up. There are roving microphones somewhere, but they'll be down the middle. Thank you. Please be ready with your questions. Gary, after those comments, I think I'll probably have to turn to Peter next, because the perspective from the NHS is a really important one. We've seen lots of examples this afternoon of how innovation ideas in the NHS can be very important in driving benefits that are directly relevant to patients, but also companies can work with the NHS to drive their value. So give us a brief comment, if you would, on some of the points that Gary raises.
Yeah, so I think Gary's right. One of the things, digital is the enabler for pathway remapping and the ability for the system to change and be more efficient. across the whole of the spectrum, and it is about a system level view, not just an individual organisational view. And I think some of the intractabilities and the challenges is in that area which Gary's made comment on. I think what's great about where we are is we've got two what's called global centres of digital excellence, which is both with Oxford Health and ourselves at AUH. And actually that ability to collaborate and bring together the record of a patient will start to create the pathway mapping which we need to do. I think there's two things I'd make as a really important point, certainly today and within the session we had. It's very clear innovation can happen. That's the first thing to say. In what is quite a structurally quite difficult or sort of organisational culture in a sense, which is again going back to where Gary is there. If you take SEND as a very prime example, and I think the fundamental building block for that was design for the clinician, not design for the system of counting, which is what the NHS does good at. So I think that's really an important facet of this. I think the other thing is that iteration process. We heard again from Sean about how iteration in development is quite crucial, and then actually put things into place which is useful, not just because it's a thing we have to have. It's a useful thing. It makes people's life and work easier. And I think the other point Gary's making a very valid point about is how do we get the patients engaged in this, right the way from the monitoring technology, and again, a couple of projects which were very clear about how we were going to monitor things, the mobile phone app and the app which looks at your gating. Those are really useful predictors, and that's the key point. And if you can get prediction in place, and if you think about the care system, we spend 120 billion on NHS, and we spend 19 billion on social services across the nation. And actually what we want to do is shift a lot of the preventative stuff into that space, because actually we can't cope as a system without doing something like that. And digital innovation is going to be the key facet for delivering some of those components. So I think that those are the things that struck me. I think the two challenges that are really fundamental is cultural change, and not invented here is not an option, because actually we haven't got the time to do that, quite frankly. And there's been some good examples, certainly in Oxford, where we've gone to the States, learnt about a pathway, taken the pathway and implemented it here. That's a really sensible piece of work we've done, and we're just starting to do the transplant surgery model on that basis. I think the other thing is the scale point about making this available across the system. I was just saying to Gary earlier in the break, we used to have the NHS Modernisation Agency, and I went to their swan song party, which means they failed. It's about how do you get spread across the system, and I think again SEND's a very good example where it's been proven in the clinical setting to work, and now the door is open to start getting more people using that type of technology in a way which is more pervasive. And getting that scaling issue sorted is quite crucial. The NHS is good at dictating from the centre, but not necessarily good at scaling from the ground. And I think we've got to get a better method of doing that.
Great, thank you for that. Chris, you gave us a talk which I think illustrated that UCB is very open to new ideas and is in fact prepared to put a lot of time and effort and money into a new understanding of disease rather than focusing on a specific product or drug target. We then had a number of talks highlighting how clinicians and scientists can work with pharmaceutical companies to even rehabilitate drugs that failed, and then through a greater or a better understanding of disease can be found very successful. What are your thoughts having listened to those presentations? Do you think they're standalone examples, or do you think there are lessons for a more general way that we should work with the pharmaceutical industry?
I think there's some tremendous lessons that I've learned here today. Unfortunately, everybody said the lucid, clever things, so I'm just going to have to ramble a bit, but I have previous in that area. I have an enthusiasm for what we're trying to do with precision medicine, but I also had an enthusiasm for what we were trying to do with stratified medicine. And before that, I was enthusiastic about personalized healthcare. And way back in the day, I was enthusiastic about pharmacogenetics. And I think one of the things that's become apparent is that we put an awful lot of shareholders' money
and a lot of taxpayers' money into this, and we've got some really great science and publications out of it. We've got some fascinating leads, but even the most biased commentator like me would find it hard to point to those big changes in patient value that 20 years ago we were all anticipating. What I think I've seen today, sort of the meta message out of it, is we're almost there. It really does feel as if things are coming together. We've begun to recognize that each of these technologies tells a small part of the story. And instead of expecting one single thing to solve everything for the patient, we've begun to recognize that there is an opportunity to build this incredible complexity of insight into a useful tool. And one of the strengths of coming together here is we've seen the two elements of this. We've seen the sophisticated wet lab analyses, and we've seen the sophisticated in silico work. And bringing those together seems to me to offer an opportunity finally to do something that reaches beyond the pages of journals with high impact factors and actually gets into the clinic. And coming away today, I've heard these stories about what's going on, and it seems not just in oncology, but in other areas, in infective disease, in inflammatory disease, we're actually ready to start to make a conjoint contribution, a collaborative contribution between the various industries and the academic communities and the clinical communities to make a difference for patients. And so I go away still enthusiastic.
Great, thank you for that. Can I ask members of the audience, please, this is your opportunity to make a comment, to ask a question related to some of the points that have been raised by our panel members, or indeed related to the presentations that you've been to in the afternoon. There's a question at the back on the right of the auditorium.
So, Chris, you mentioned that it's taken maybe 20 years for us to reach perhaps a kind of tipping point in precision medicine. So if you would look into your crystal ball 20 years down the track from now, how would you see this as impacting on the traditional pharmaceutical company business models that still prevail today?
It's very interesting because when you sit down and look at the business model of reducing the number of people who you treat, obviously that's something that it's difficult to square with it being more advantageous to the industry. But we start to think about the other benefits of having a better therapy. It's sustainable value for patients. It's going to be used more easily. You will have a greater equity in the marketplace. And I think that there's a great future for a collaborative approach in which industry is as open as it can be about the values of its products. It collaborates with the users of those products to make sure they're used in the most efficient way. And then that innovation is rewarded by society with appropriate pricing on the value that's being delivered. But that's going to be a complex and negotiated outcome, and we're just taking the first baby steps towards it.
Great, thank you for that. Another question? One right at the back, Richard Lewitsky.
Okay, thanks. Peter, we've talked today about the importance of data. The NHS sits on a goldmine of data, and I know that you and the Caldecott Guardian has been quite instrumental in trying to allow access to some of that data for innovation purposes. But it's a highly regulated area. Could you talk a little bit about how access to this data could be maximized for the purposes of innovation?
Sure, yeah. Previously I've worked with DMPN in my role at the Department of Health on this space as well, and having spent a lot of time trying to make sure we are very clear about what we're doing with data, particularly for research, and that's been quite a major facet. I think we've got into this unhealthy debate in the country, which is about misunderstanding what the law states as part of that. There's also a very unhealthy tendency not to be transparent and clear about it. And those are the two tensions you have in data protection law. And the reality is actually, I think the world is in a sensible place. So, anything that's anonymized is outside of the Data Protection Act. And yes, there are risks around that, and let's not walk away from that. But actually, you've got other parts of law like contract law and also common law to deal with those issues when people do overstep the mark and don't do what they say they do with the data. I think you've then got a lot of regulations. So we've got the Data Protection Act, and that's going to change to the General Data Protection Regulation, subject to what happens through the Brexit negotiations and whether we translate it into UK law verbatim or not. The Department of Media, Sport and Cultures are leading with that particular aspect of the negotiation that will happen over the next couple of years. The other parts of law are laws. So at the moment, we have this concept that it's my data. Actually, it's data about you. That's the technical term in law. And the key facet of understanding that is it's a combination of bits of information you bring together, which is of different actors who contributed to that. And it is about you as an individual patient. That data is collected with that common structure of common law, which says actually I'll keep it confidential unless I do something otherwise. And it's about making sure we engineer that expectation of what we're going to do in that pact we've just created. So actually being very clear that the NHS is about both delivery of care, it's about improving the quality and safety of care, which indicates you will have to do something with research, and you have to do something with innovation. So actually the final element of that is being transparent with the population about that's what we do. And actually I've done a lot of town meetings where most people think we're using data in research. That's what they think. Care.data didn't help because what it did is really set up an antibody in the system which created a general reluctance and risk averseness across data controllers effectively. But the reality is that actually data aggregated at an anonymized level is very, very useful research. You can do lots of interesting things, and actually research has got a good track record in that area. So the breaches haven't. Oops, I apologise. Is that a comment on what I was saying? That was the Information Commissioner by no. And actually, you know, okay. Obviously, I'm going to prison now. But you know, and I've worked with the Information Commission over many years to make sure we're very clear and transparent about that. And innovation actually requires data at different levels. You know, when we use data that we're going to track people on, we do generally ask for consent if it's required in an RCT as an example. So you know, I don't think research is the bad villain here, because actually it's a very well orchestrated and well regulated area. I just think we've got ourselves into a particular mire in this space, and Dame Fiona is very much trying to get us out of that at the moment, and getting a proper dialogue with the population. I think there's some very clear red lines, particularly about commercial use of data, and that's very, very clear that the population have fed back that they don't see insurance companies having access to this data. There's a term that's come out of the Care Act, which is called medical benefit. If you translate that into public benefit, that's broadly what it's about, using data to create public benefit, new innovation, new research, and we need to be in that space, really.
Great, thank you for that very interesting point. Comment right down at the front. We've got a number of questions, so can I ask now that they're very brief? The question is, come down to the front, please, with the microphone. Very brief question, and to whoever it is directed, could we have a short answer so that we can get some more comments in?
My question
please,
is short.
sir.
I would like to see the data in terms of strategy. This means how you relate the data and develop some common strategy or direction where everybody can move, including the startups or the innovation. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a difficult question. So how to generate a coherent strategy to foster innovation and startups? Who wants to deal with that one? Peter's volunteering. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was saying earlier, one of the problems we have is we have a very powerful and effective strategy for health research in this country with NIHR. I mean, great legacy that Dame Sally left, and that's continuing. I think we have a clear strategy for health services in terms of Simon Stevens, where we're trying to get to.
Yep.
I mean, we've got lots of problems financially, but there's a clear strategy. You might not agree with it, but it's clear. We don't have a clear strategy for innovation, and I think that's where the data piece comes in. So a strategy means you have a plan about what it's going to achieve, what the infrastructure is you're going to put in place to deliver it, what the expectations of the partners are. So I agree with you. So the question is, whose job is it to create that strategy?
Okay, so that's
So can I make a quick venture on Gary's
Please.
great challenge?
Because I think comment is a contentious point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think John Bell in the industrial strategy is trying to therefore do that particular piece, and that strategy is yet to emerge, but it's in gestation at the moment. So there's a lot of thinking going around it, and I think that strategy will start to think about how we use the digital platforms we have to create value in that space, and particularly how we get innovation to flow into it. So I think that's where we start.
I think it probably needs to be an integrated strategy, not just for health. Actually, it needs to be a whole.
And it may be that I think it's a very important point that innovation and strategy, perhaps 10 years ago, wouldn't have been seen together in the same sentence. It was something that either happened or didn't, and you took advantage of it in a rather opportunistic way. And I think it's good to hear that there is a way to strategize about innovation. I wanted to maybe ask Hugh for a comment on this. I mean, universities are charged with basic research and teaching and education principally. Hugh, you head up a very large department, and obviously the RDM is proud of some of the innovations and the advances which RDM has contributed to. But how do you balance that when in fact the principle of research and teaching for the sake of research and teaching may not always be seen as obviously aligned with innovation, number one, and number two, a greater understanding that comes through research sometimes means that the anticipated innovation has to be held back and thought about a bit longer. So, understanding genomic data might 5 years ago have been seen as a very straightforward advancement. It's not quite so straightforward. How do you balance the challenges of basic research in an academic university department with the desire to innovate?
So I guess our primary metrics by which we judge our research success, I'm not really thinking about teaching, really does come down to the peer review science process and publication. And we won't move very far away from that. And that probably means that the number one driver is to try to do experiments that test a hypothesis to destruction. And if it falls over and it turns out it was wishful thinking, your job as an academic to say is it sounds beautiful to stratify this way, actually it doesn't work, and we have to publish that. And I think that remains our core business. And that is different from the commercial sector where you've got responsibility to shareholders and other pressures. That said, there are a couple of drivers that will mean that where the science does stack up, we absolutely must push it down to useful fruition. And again, coming back to metrics, we are being measured on impact increasingly. And if we look at the success that will sometimes get a university into the headline, it often isn't a paper in Nature. It may be a paper in a very lowly journal, but one that actually really delivers, in this case, for healthcare. And that's a pressure that we feel and I think we should support. And then the other thing that I think will drive this where it is favorable, our old-fashioned funding model doesn't work very well. So if you hire a clever scientist who does experiments and gets grants from the Wellcome Trust, you haven't got any money in the kitty at the end of the year. If that clever scientist can also generate wealth and commercial opportunities as well as good science and good medicine, your department is invigorated. And so we'll endorse that. Yeah,
great. And of course, there are other examples, and Chris, asked for your comment here, the idea that pharmaceutical companies can understand the ecosystem within a university academic environment and has the confidence to invest in high-level strategic partnerships that take advantage of access to science and ideas, even if they're not directly related to the development of an innovation or a product, I think is a really important part of that relationship.
Yeah, and I think it's been a journey and a change for us. We're trying to move much more into a model of genuine partnership, where the pharmaceutical industry brings something to the joint endeavor other than a checkbook. And that's got to be a big part of the future success of this collaboration.
Great, thank you. Any more comments from members of the audience? I think there was a hand up earlier on, please.
A question. That one.
Yeah, carry on.
So with these sort of advantages of digitalization of our healthcare and our services in our NHS, which I think has very clear advantages, but again today there's a massive global ransomware attack going on, and previously that shut down the NHS. How do we control for all our wearables feeding in data and multiple different types of systems feeding into our centralized system? How do we control for vulnerabilities to attack?
Yeah, very good. I think Peter's probably the person to answer that one.
Yes, so you'll be pleased to know that the last attack we survived very well in Oxfordshire, and that's because we take quite a strategic approach to handling that. And I think one of the things that one will have to start looking at is provenance of data. Probably Lionel's best sort of focused on some of this stuff than me in terms of the detail, but the reality is, we have to protect our borders very clearly, because that's something where we want to stop invasion of attack into a healthcare system. We saw what happened in some of the London trusts, which actually ended up delaying care, basically, and that's not a good position to be in. The other part of the equation is to make sure you are up to date with what you're doing. That's the key, so make sure you're using the right platforms. And then the final component of that is then looking at the threats and risks. And I think as we add in new data feeds, we're going to be more vulnerable. So these are all risk management tools. We might survive this time, but we might not survive next time if there's another backdoor found in some mechanism. So we've got to be prepared for all of that. And in reality, that's the design we have to put in place. But knowing the provenance of the data and knowing whether you can turn it down or switch it off at a moment's notice is quite key to this.
Good, thank you. One comment I'd ask Gary is that we heard about the difficulties within an NHS environment of rolling out an innovation like the SEND project between multiple NHS organisations, and of course then the success story of licensing that technology with a commercial partner through Drayton Technologies, which then, if you like, opens the gates to taking advantage of an innovation across the NHS and indeed globally. So do you want to make a comment as your work with the AHSN, and how should we unlock? On the one hand, the NHS is very unified. We're all patients of the whole NHS. We all have an NHS number. As Peter's described, there is a move towards greater sharing of data access, but ultimately individual NHS organisations still have significant differences that might need to be overcome in order to roll out a new innovation.
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've learned a lot from working with Lionel's team's innovations in the last few years. So I think the first thing is that you can look at innovation, as you were saying earlier, Keith, as being this sort of shiny thing and people will want to use it. Or you can take a much more managed approach to it and say you have to have a system and you need to procure it. So you then need to go through a whole process of analysing strategic need, what the specific barriers are in individual organisations, and how you'll need to adjust that innovation to fit in with the care pathway or the particular features of that service, because they all differ. And that was what we found with the gestational diabetes monitoring system, working very well, but it wasn't spreading. But we had to have quite a lot of detailed conversations with my innovation adoption team as to what were the specific issues in terms of putting it into another service in, say, Reading or Bucks. And I think you do need to have a managed process for that. And we use a particular approach. There's no one approach, but it doesn't just happen. The next thing is, I think, a more general one, and I think others have talked about this, that the route by which we spread digital innovation is not yet sorted out, and there is no one solution. But we don't have a sort of clear commercialization pathway for many of the products, and some of them are fairly simple, but they don't need a sort of big company behind them. They still need some professional support. And so if you look at, for example, an app you would use, which is going to change clinical management, for example, with shared decision making, we had one you can't just put it out there. You've got to have best available data. You've got to manage regulatory risk, etc., etc. So I think that is another area we're really interested in working in, and I think we've got a real unique opportunity with lots of the things you've heard today, with sort of university innovations and a lot going on as to what are the different models, and understanding right at the beginning and start to think about it when you first develop your app. What is the end means you're going to get that into the system, at least in the NHS and ideally abroad.
Good. Thank you very much for those comments.